There's a supposed schedule on the next schedule. No, seriously, you had to go that way. They're not actually and back up.
Everybody standing in the aisle, please take your seats. I think we want to start early and end at 8 o'clock sharp. Eight o'clock. That's 2000. 8 p.m. It's 6 to 8. Yeah, people at the back. Let's get going. So, good evening, everyone. I'm Yaron Scheffer. I'm not Eric Berger. Eric is joining us remotely, and yeah, let's go. Very quick look at the note well, and so this is the second BOF session for Lurk. We got some clarity. Ooh. You go ahead. Thank you. We got some clarity last time. We had a well-attended interim meeting where we got some more focus on what we want to achieve. And here we are to discuss the scope, to take a quick look at two potential solutions at the protocol level, but this is definitely not the focus of this meeting. The focus of the meeting is the second part, where we look at the proposed working group charter and we ask ourselves whether we want to charter a working group. So this is the chair's intro. Yeah, less than 10 minutes with a delay. Then we will dive into use cases and we will look at two solution alternatives, one called certificate delegation, which I will present, and the Lurk TLS protocol, which Daniel will present. And that will wrap it for the technical deep dive. So I do not expect a deeper discussion of protocol details on either of the solutions. Next, I will present the charter that was already posted to the mailing list. And if you're not on the Lurk mailing list, this is a good time to do it. We will have an open discussion, and then we will ask the questions. Okay, so next is Daniel with the use cases.
Hi. So currently we got 4 use cases. The first use case, next slide. Okay. So let's start with the Lurk architecture. So it's composed of a TLS client, a TLS server that is split into 2 functions, which is the edge server and the key server that owns the private key. So the TLS connection is between the TLS client and the edge server. But in order to, well, all the authentication credentials based on the private key are provided by the key server to the edge server, and, well, the session is finalized between the TLS client and the edge server at the end. So with that architecture, we got 4 use cases. The first one, which is containers and virtual machines. So the problem is that, well, when we have a lot of containers on host, we really have no control of the private key. So the private key is copied into all the running instances of the VMs or the containers, as well as in the persistent image. So we're just lacking some control of that private key. What Lurk is expected to do is to protect this private key against leakage. So what we are outsourcing this private key from the VM to the key server, and by outsourcing we prevent direct also access to that private key. Unless you're the key server, no one should be able to read that private key. And in addition, we just control what are the operations performed on that with that private key. So that's the main goal. Next slide. So then we get a second use case, which is the content provider use case. So the problem is that when you're deploying a lot of edge server, in order to secure your infrastructure, you're providing different implementations. But the thing is that by having different implementations, you just increase the risk that one vulnerability is occurring of one of your edge servers. And if one vulnerability has happened and this edge server is hosting the private key, then the private key is just leaking. And one vulnerability is sufficient to affect the whole service. So in that case, it's pretty similar to the previous case. The benefit from Lurk is that you outsource this private key to a key server. So you prevent the leakage of the private key, you restrict the operations, and actually no one got access to this key. A third use case. So that's relations between the content owner and the content provider. So the problem is that when you're a content owner, so it's basically the URL, and you want to use a CDN to deliver your content, you don't necessarily want to provide the CDN your private key. And maybe the CDN doesn't really want to get your private key either. So So, I mean, one of the questions is, why should I provide the content to the CDN and not the private key? Well, sometimes the private key got more value than the content itself. One example is if you got a lot of legacy devices that are using that is configured with the public key. In case the private key is leaking, then we have to reconfigure all these devices. If that's possible. Sometimes the value of the content is just ephemeral compared to the private key, which is long term. And sometimes the content is encrypted. So, well, the value associated to the encrypted content is not that much. So what Lurk enables is to, well, to have operations with that private key without providing the private key. So it enables really interoperability between the different independent administrative domains. In this case, that's the content owner and the CDN. And in the last use case, well, it's very similar to the previous one, except that the interactions between the content owner and the CDN are mostly between one CDN and another CDN. So in some time, well, the content owner is contracting with a CDN, and this CDN might be willing to delegate some of the content delivery to another CDN. But the content owner got no contract with the delegating CDN. So what should be possible is to have some interactions between these two CDNs, or eventually between the delegating CDNs and the content owner. So similarly to the previous use case, Lurk is expected to make possible two different domains to interoperate. And that's it, I think. So I think we should skip that slide. So thank you.
Dmitry Belevsky, Technical Center of Internet. Could you return the 2 slides before the last use case? Yeah. If we want to protect the authentication of Edge server to accept to enable access to the K server, I think we should establish relation with the external CDN, the second one, to whom the first CDN which we are in contact has delegated the providing of content. So it seems to me that it may be not a completely valid use case. Thank you.
So just what you're saying is that we got the content owner.
Yeah.
CDN1, CDN2.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is that we need some interactions between CDN2 and the content owner.
Not CDN2 and content owner, but CDN2 and contents and case server.
Yeah, so that's a content owner.
Yeah.
In that case.
Okay.
Oh yeah, okay.
Okay.
All
Okay.
right. Okay.
Okay.
One of the things, well, I mean, it might be possible, but the other thing is that you get a contract with the one you're delegating. So you have cascading, so the content, CDN1 is proxying the request from CDN2 because the contract is between the two CDNs.
So the authentication to the case at the case server level is provided with credentials by the. I got that. Thank you.
Okay.
More questions?
Please.
Well, I guess this is a question for the chairs. Is there supposed to be consensus on these use cases?
Can you repeat that?
Yes. Is there supposed to be consensus on these use cases?
So actually, we will discuss one specific use case in the scope of the proposed charter, and that's specifically number 3 here. So not this one, the previous one, this one. So simple CDN versus content owner. That's the only one that we've reached consensus on the mailing list and during the previous 2 meetings. And that's the only one that's in scope for the current proposed charter.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Subodhanger. I know it's limited, but it seems like this is useful in other cases as well. Like you're running a server in a untrusted environment where you want to like restrict the time duration of like compromise, or like the compromise of a particular like was that discussed like as a potential use case?
That was Subodh. So Martin Thompson, the use case that Subodh identified, I don't think appeared on those slides, did it? But it is exactly the sort of one that we've been discussing, and I think the one that we have people using most often, which is I'm a large CDN provider, and I happen to have boxes that are hosted in hostile regions for various reasons. It doesn't really matter. And I don't want to put my private keys on those servers, but I'm quite happy giving them access over the internet to acquire signatures or whatever they need to operate their servers. That's the same entity at both ends, and there's no distinction between a content provider.
That's actually, Daniel, please.
Well, go.
Was it the previous one?
Yeah, so that's essentially with different names. It's this
It's just different
use case.
actors. Yeah, same basic thing. Yeah.
However, again, the one use case that we'll be focusing on for the proposed charter is content owner versus CDN. And I mean, this is the place to say otherwise, but so far we've been able to reach consensus only on that one.
So from my perspective, all these boil down to the same basic architecture, and as long as we can agree that the architecture exists, then we don't actually need to worry about the specifics of the use cases. Is that right? Okay. Eric Riscola says that the first solution doesn't address some of the use cases, so we'll get to that.
This is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. So in the use case that you say we're focusing on, this next one here, we're clear that there's no attempt to detect serving wrong content or
Please refer your question to.
Sorry, can you advance the slide though, please? Yeah, so in this use case, there's no attempt, we're not claiming that any of the proposals are going to prevent the content provider from serving wrong data, right? Or being able to detect when, this authentication is going to happen. You're saying, yeah, go ahead and pretend to be me for a while. You don't know how long the while is. You don't know, right? So in particular, what this gives us is not that we're going to prevent them from impersonating us. Just that when we decide that we don't want them to be able to impersonate us anymore, we can stop. We can tell them to stop, and they won't, and we'll be able to force them to stop. Right? That's the specific goal. Not that we're going to prevent them from impersonating us or misusing our public key. Exactly. I just want to be clear that that's what we're talking about.
So I see 2 questions. The first one is, do we provide any mechanisms so that the edge server can deliver other content than the one provided by the content providers? I think no.
Wait, the edge server clearly can deliver any arbitrary content they want under this key, right?
Yeah.
And we're not pretending that we're going to prevent that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Right. So
But the other, if I'm correct, did you ask also if we, well, did you also ask that whether we can stop, we just, it can be seen as, okay, you can pretend I am myself, and I'm able to say, no, you're not able, you're not able anymore to pretend that I'm me.
right, so I can say that because I haven't given you the private key that corresponds to the credential. So I can say you can no longer demonstrate proof of possession of my key because I've controlled the key the whole time.
Exactly.
That said, they may continue to impersonate you for a while if they've established some session, TLS session cache or whatever.
Yeah.
But right, so they only get the use of the key and you know when they use your key at the very least.
Exactly.
That's all we're talking about. We're not talking about that they can't impersonate you.
So yeah, that was actually like a good lead into my question, basically. But Subodhanga, is the scope of the charter only to like deal with certificate-based authentication, or like basically you have like other authentication as well, which could exceed the lifetime of the cert that you actually give it? For example, you give the cert for 3 days, but a malicious CDN who you want to stop, like with the previously we didn't have a way to restrict the limit the lifetime of the tickets, for instance. And only recently it was added to the spec that the tickets are limited lifetime of 7 days. So are we going to look at like not only long-term certificates, but also like session tickets and session ID-based resumption and those kind of things?
Not that I know. Well, currently I haven't seen any proposal addressing this scope. So it's only the authentication. But I'm not saying it's not going to be extended.
Yeah, it's not a question about concrete, like I didn't want concrete, like, oh, we have a solution to this kind of thing, but like, is the working group, like, basically as a BOF, right? Like, I guess, like, is the working group going to work on like solutions for also protecting like limited small credentials and stuff like that? Like, for example, like in the architecture, basically, there are obviously certain like cases which are not covered, like what happens if you re-auth or something like that in the post handshake or like those kind of things. Yeah.
Let me try to answer that. So first of all, from a formal point of view, we haven't discussed it, and therefore it's not part of the proposed charter, and the charter is basically about certificates. So personal opinion here, if this can be added with no client-side changes, which I doubt, then I think it's a very good idea. I mean, should be in scope, and we might want to squeeze it into scope later. But client-side changes are absolutely out of scope, the way I see it and the way I will present the charter that we've reached.
Alex Mayover, I have to admit I'm completely new to this. I haven't been watched the space before. Did you also consider the case for Open DNS, for DNSSEC, where you signing a zone? So would this also be covered, or are you thinking about certificates mostly? Or HTTP-based applications?
So are you asking to Yaron or me?
Whoever feels competent to ask. So my specific question is, have you thought about DNSSEC zone signing as a use case where?
We have actually discussed it a little bit. There was not enough interest, and it's sort of explicitly out of scope right now.
Okay, thank you.
So we have a proposal, a draft proposal, like for delegated certificates, which is quite similar to like the delegated certificate proposal in Lurk, for instance, but it's like a little bit more invasive to like the CA model and like authentication and stuff like that. Would you be willing to take that on as like a part of the Lurk proposal, or is it like out of scope as well?
So there is no working group, so I'm not a working group chair, and even if I was, it wouldn't be my decision. Having said that, the draft you're referring to, if I read it correctly, assumes, so it's not quite clear what the credentials are, but presumably it might mean client-side changes, and it might mean some X509 tweaks. So that's absolutely out of scope of what we're seeing here. All right. Thank you, Daniel. Okay, so now hats off. This is a possible solution to the one use case of CDN versus content owner. As Echo mentioned, this does not solve some other use cases. Well, the main point of the draft is from basic engineering point of view, you don't want to continue each TLS handshake into a second box. So can you do something that will give time-limited credentials into the CDN instead of having it continue each and every TLS handshake back into the content owner, which is presumably a different administrative domain, possibly remote, and so on. If we're talking about having the key server on the CDN's network, that essentially means that we've given the private key to the CDN, which we probably don't want to do. On the other hand, if the key server is on the content owner side, it means that the content owner now needs to engineer for the scale that the CDN is actually meant to do for them. So the scalability and reliability requirements are something that the content owner presumably didn't want to take on, and therefore outsourced it to the CDN. So this draft is an alternative solution for the same problem with no ongoing protocol between the CDN and the content owner, and still with no changes to the client side. And yeah, I added that sub-bullet to refer to your draft that was just mentioned. So it's really very, very simple. The content owner needs to be able to get a certificate every, say, 3 days. Acme is the obvious solution for that nowadays, and the whole draft is about a really trivial REST-based protocol for the CDN to go and fetch this short-term credential from the content owner every few days. And yeah, that's about it. You get it back as a PKCS12 package with the private key. So that's somewhat ugly, and people might have preferred to see an actual CSR going from the CDN into the content owner and get back a certified public key. So yeah, on the other hand, that would mean that the content owner needs to do all the validation checking on the CSR, which, in my opinion, is just more security issues waiting to happen compared to the content owner actually generating the private key, like ephemerally for a few seconds, sending it over and be done with it. So yeah, I realize it's not best practice, but there's a reason to that, and Ecker just cannot. Yeah,
No,
please.
I'm waiting. I'm just trying to move the mic. Go ahead. I mean, so I'm sorry. I don't know. What do you want? Do you want me to wait? Do you want me
No, go ahead, please.
I mean, the usual procedure is to have if you're worried about the validity of the CSR, the usual procedure would be for the content owner to construct the CSR, modulo the key material, send it over, have the other guy shove the key material in and sign it, and then you'll just do memcomp to verify it's the same.
Yeah, I'm worried about the content on. Sorry.
I presume your concern is that the CDN sends the content owner some ASM1 blob, which he then has to validate it matches what he thinks it matches. But what you do is
policy, blah blah blah.
Right, but what you do is you generate the CSR as a template. There's the CSR as a template with a empty spot for the public key, and sends it over, and then just compares the bits.
I'm all for it. Thank you.
So this is DKG. I'm a little confused as to why we've got Acme plus this. It's just so that.
Simply because it's an easy way to get a certificate in an automated manner, because otherwise you just can't do it every 3 days.
Sure, but if Acme provides you with that way, then what is, I guess I'm just not understanding what the extra step here is. Sorry, I'm not understanding.
No, this is not, so I'm sort of building on Acme's ability to get the certificates, but the extra step is just the definition of the URLs for the REST protocol. It's really a very basic REST API. That's all there is to it.
It's a REST API on top.
It's a REST API. Sorry?
A REST API on top of the Acme REST API?
No, because it's between different entities. This is a REST API between the CDN and the content owner, with the content owner being responsible to get the certificate somehow, and that somehow is presumably Acme.
I got it. So, sorry, what I was not understanding was the content owner has a channel to an existing CA. This is how you avoid any changes to the client side. So the content owner doesn't become a CA in this case. Okay.
And just Joe Sullivan, and presumably you couldn't just use Acme from the CDN because it couldn't verify, or is.
So let me answer that later. So let me move on with the slides, then take more questions. Oops. Sorry. Okay, I got my machine stuck. Okay, so while I'm dealing with it, so the next slide, if I remember correctly, is about security considerations, and the main, sorry? Oh, okay. So upon compromise, you may or may not revoke the short-term certificate, probably not, and you have the CDN with a 3-day certificate, and next time they come in, you simply don't give them a new certificate. So that's sort of similar to Daniel's proposal, except at a different time granularity. Apologize for that. Okay. Now, security considerations. The main part of the security considerations is how to prevent a CDN from actually going to ACME and getting a certificate for a domain that they're delegated into but do not own. And that's actually a problem that's in the ACME domain, in my opinion. So it's an interesting problem in itself, and will probably need to be resolved somehow, whether we decide, whether this putative working group decides to adopt this draft or not. So even if we use Daniel's proposed protocol, we still have this problem of a rogue CDN or a rogue CDN employee being able to get an ACME certificate for the domain that they don't own but they are delegated into.
So Ted Hardy speaking as chair of ACME from this microphone. If you have a use case like this you'd like to bring to ACME, there have been some ideas around this. For example, recording in a DNS record what challenge types are permitted for particular domains, and for domains which have been delegated in this way, permitting only challenge types which cannot be met by the CDN but could only be met by the domain owner. I agree with you that if you're going to use ACME for this, some of the current ACME challenges would leave you with this problem, and you would need then to both have a mechanism for restricting what challenges were present and a mechanism at that point to distribute that restriction. We're happy to talk about that. The ACME is in the middle of deciding whether or not it's going to recharter to take on new work. So if you feel like this is new work for ACME, please write a draft on that issue for us, and we'll then consider whether or not it can be adopted. Thanks.
Yeah, so again, as an individual contributor here, I will wait for Lurk to, if it is created, to make up its mind about the preferred solution, and then we will see what happens with the security considerations on this one.
So speaking as chair of ACME, please don't, because it sounds like a rogue CDN, whether they're using Lurk or not, might still meet some of our challenges, and raising that point to our mailing list would be useful. Thank you.
Point taken. Thank you. All right. More questions to this proposal?
Hi, Subodh. So one comment I had was like, if we're doing very short-lived certificates, one of the things we've seen is like majority of our errors actually come from client clock skew issues, and like a huge percentage, I can disclose it like in private, but one of the things that would be useful is like if a proposal, basically like the proposal made it such that like you could request certs which are valid for like 3 months in the future, but like more in the past. So we see mostly clock skews are like skewed towards the past rather than the future. So that's like something to keep in mind, and like maybe useful to like increase the adoption of this thing or something. Yeah.
Bilhan Baker, just replying to that. This is why most of the short-lived certs proposals are for 3-day certs, because most of the cases are the clock's either skewed 24 hours ahead or behind. And if the clock's skewed more than that, well, your regular PKI should probably be kicking the certificate out anyway, because you don't know the OCSP token date. You know, you're going to be getting errors anyway. It is not, you're not meant to be able to use the web PKI unless your clock is synchronized to the universal clock within a day.
Mm-hmm.
Ben Schwartz, Jigsaw. It seems to me that the primary use of this is for users who are actually under attack. They're people who use CDNs and are concerned that essentially their keys at the CDN might be compromised, and what they do is essentially sufficiently sensitive that they're worried about the security implications of that. People in that position often also are using CDNs because they're not capable of spinning up enough server infrastructure to survive a distributed denial of service attack, which is another common way to attack a sensitive organization. But if I have to, as a server operator, run a highly available server, and if a denial of service attack manages to take down my certificate vending server for more than 3 days, then my website goes offline. So that, I think that might be an indication that it would be better, for example, to have a way to give the CDN a restricted access to the CA to be able to pull its own time-limited certificates, or another mechanism. Because if I have to, if I'm a small news organization trying to keep a website up under attack from political opposition, then having to keep my server vendor machine running doesn't help.
So I agree. I don't want to overload the word delegation too much, but yes, delegating the authority to issue certificates for limited time certificates is very interesting, but it's significantly more complex than what I'm proposing here. That's definitely an option.
This is DKG. I just wanted to raise one additional thing, which is the way that this interacts with certificate transparency. So just putting it on out there so that we're aware, certificate transparency logs scale with the number of certificates ever issued. So if we do move to this approach, we should be aware that that means the logs will be significantly larger.
Your co-chair wants to close the line.
Yeah, we're okay, so next is Daniel again.
So this is a very early and draft proposal, and I'm just going to explain it very briefly over 10 minutes and no more. So the scope is restricted to TLS, and it's just a query exchange protocol between an edge server and a key server. The authentication method we considered were RSA, ECDHE, RSA, and ECDSA, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And TLS version 1.2, and it's a binary protocol. Does that mean it's not going to change later? Next slide. So the edge server is sending a query with a query header, a query payload, and receive from the key server a response, which is composed of a response header and a response payload. Next slide. So I just put key exchange with TLS just to figure out, to make it sure that the interactions with ECDHA between the edge server and the key server is just occurring in red. So the edge server is asking for the key server to sign some parameters. So next slide. So the first thing we notice is that compared to the standard TLS, is that, well, with TLS, TLS provides a random, the client random and the server random is provided by the TLS server. If we outsource that to the key server, well, the edge server is kind of likely to provide the client random and the server random. So is likely to impose 64 bits, whereas in regular TLS it's 32. But on the other hand, well, TLS clients are not really the same as edge server, because edge server are supposed to be authenticated. And this can be addressed by, well, having the server random as a compromise between the edge server and the key server. Well, basically, it only means that the edge server is going to send a nonce, and a crypto operations is going to be done with that nonce, and predictably, the key server is going to return the random used by the server. So, well, we are back to 32 in that case. Next slide. So,
I'm sorry, but that's not correct. You're signing, the first 32 are always under control of the client or the edge server in this case, but the difference is that the suffix is also under control of the edge server. So it's a sandwich between the uncontrolled prefix and the uncontrolled suffix with partial control stuff in the middle. So it's not just the first 32.
So,
yeah, okay, this is technical, but
No, this one?
the next one. It's technical, but any TLS 1.2 server at all right now exposes you to a signing oracle where the client is allowed to control the first 32 octets, but has no control of the subsequent n minus 32, right? The worst case scenario for Lurk is that the edge server is allowed to control all the data which is signed. The plausible best case scenario for Lurk is the one where they still don't have control of the first 32. So the edge server has control of the first 32, and it has control of the last, like, between 32 and 256 octets. But without doing something to, like, without somehow constraining their choice of the Diffie-Hellman exponent.
okay.
That's like really important, right?
Yeah,
You don't have a protocol for fixing that.
Okay, right. I'm coming in the next slide to that. Okay, so next slide. So, well, the signature is bound to the TLS, the two randoms with ECDHA, but not the TLS version and the authentication method. So as a result, it gives a signature can be used across different TLS version, authentication method, and the sign parameters. So, well, TLS 1.3 solves this issue first. So let's see the case where we have a key server providing this ECDHA and RSA. The private key is only hosted on the key server, and the TLS version are only going to be 1.1, 1.2. Next slide. So I'm just looking at if we can perform some cross-protocol attacks between the versions. Well, since the methods are provided and imposed by the key server, and these methods are the same across the different versions, so the use of a different TLS version is kind of limited. Then what about the signature scheme? Well, RSA is used in two signature methods, DHA and ECDHA. Well, currently we only provide ECDHA, but I suppose. So the collisions is restricted between, and well, ECDSA is only used in one authentication method. So the collision restriction is between DHE RSA and ECDHA RSA. Now, what about the sign parameters? So they do have we do have a probability of collision. So we should find a way so that we can make sure that when I'm signing ECDHA, it cannot be used by DHE. So, Eric?
I'm sorry, I think you're misunderstanding the issue. The concern here is not that the edge server forges a new TLS handshake with parameters of his choice. That doesn't help him because he already has the corresponding private key for whatever he's being signed. So that would just let him break that connection. The concern is that he forges an entirely non-TLS message and signs it with a TLS key. The concern, I mean, bear in mind that the underlying assumption is that the edge server is willing to sign a public key corresponding to a private key that the key server is willing to sign a public key corresponding to a private key that the edge server already knows. So it doesn't do the edge server any good to swap the algorithms around, because he already knows the corresponding private key, which is what he would gain by doing that. What he's trying to do is imagine you had someone was running a CA certificate on their TLS server. And so what I do is I manage to craft a transcript which looks like a certificate, and I get a TBS certificate. I can sign that. That's the concern. So it's not cross protocol between TLS versions. It's cross protocol between TLS and other stuff.
I guess, but would checking the content that is being signed address this issue?
But again, but in 1.2, the content that is being signed, again, is 32 octets that are under the client's control, 32 octets that in the strongest case are under the key server's control, followed by some junk, followed by a bunch of stuff that's under the edge server's control again. And like, I've not yet convinced the administration that I can't generate a TBS certificate that will fit in that pattern or some other thing, right? I kind of feel like I'm rehashing my email, so I don't really want to like spend a lot of time on that. But I guess, I think what I suggest is take a step back, which is that this is all what you're trying to do here is arrange that you're trying to harden this system against abuse by the edge server. And I would suggest that that is probably fraught and not going to work. And you'd be better off just admitting it's a signing oracle and saying you should isolate your certificates and calling it a day. Now, maybe someone has a better design than I have, but the best designs I have are a lot of work and still involve a fair amount of exposure that I don't know how to close.
I'd like to respond to that in the context of the charter, and you pointed out correctly that the charter is kind of vague about this point. And the charter is vague about this point because it definitely looks like the signing oracle problem can be mitigated but cannot be solved. And so this room will need to decide whether, given that we still have a partial signed oracle with some caveats and some things that we may be able to add some checks to, but will not be able to completely fix, whether we are still interested in having this solution, and in particular, given that the client side of this protocol needs to be authenticated in any case. So there is an ongoing relationship between the CDN and the content owner.
Philhan Baker, I can't quite see why TLS uses signature in its key exchange at all. It's just a stupid idea. And I think that if you want to close the door on this type of attack, what you need to do is to re-engineer TLS in a way that means that you can solve it more competently. I mean, you should not have signature in a key agreement because you're dropping bits. You're establishing somebody communicated with this server, and you can creating a non-repudiable proof of that. That is bad design.
Yeah, and we cut the line after you. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Subodh. Just thinking like, have you started making the Lurk server like a little bit more complicated? Essentially, like basically it has to now like generate Lurk server as in like the content owner essentially. Like it can generate the Diffie-Hellman key in at least 1.2 and send it down like as a part of the Lurk protocol or something like that. So you would avoid the total control of basically the suffix and the prefix in that case. Yeah, you could do the whole server key exchange. You could just like have that one, the content owner generate the server key exchange message and send it down and send the private keys as well along with it. But at least in that case, like the content owner controls the whole server side part, but it goes into trade-offs of like how much complexity you want to like introduce in the content owner versus like, yeah.
So maybe next slide. I think we discussed that. Yeah, next slide maybe. So, well, with this slide, what I just want to specify is that, well, actually, it's a much more, well, what we're preventing is the leak, so we should evaluate what is the risk of leaking against the signing oracle and how you can detect that. So, as we just talked, there is a trade-off between the mitigation we can have, and actually there's significant improvement by just centralizing the control into the app server, in the key server. So we should not keep out of mind that simply isolating the key solve significant problem for the content delivery and so. So thank you.
So I have a different question, which you may not know the answer to, but I'm hoping somebody in the room does. Your proposal, as I understand it, your proposal handles only ephemeral cipher suites, correct?
Only ephemeral?
Yes.
Yeah, ECDHA and...
Right. So as I recall, the opening bid for this BOF was do not change TLS clients. So what fraction of TLS clients will be broken by refusing to accept static RSA?
Well, I think we stayed...
I suspect quite high, that's why I'm asking.
So what is the fraction of?
So, it's driving me nuts. So the opening bid of this BOF was it has to work with essentially every client, and you can't change them. And so my question is, by imposing a rule that clients have to do something ephemeral, what fraction of clients do you break? So if the answer is you break a lot of them, then the basic premise of the scheme doesn't work. Because then you might as well change the clients and figure the browsers will roll out.
Rich solves. I actually think it breaks 0 clients because they all support ephemeral. I mean, how far back do you have to go? Does it have to be a client written? Does it have to be a client written in, say, this? Yeah. I guess that's easier than getting taller. Does it have to be a client written in this century, for example? SSL2 clients. We have SSL3 clients only. Does that have to work? I think saying can break no clients is... Clients are already broken.
This is DKG.
So actually, we're running late. Moving into the charter discussion. So I will present the charter first. I'm sure everything you were going to say applies to the charter as well. So let's do that with the charter in mind. So there's a very lengthy introduction that please just read it. I'm not going to read it out loud. And then the actual meat comes in the next slide. All right. So the working group will focus on a solution that allows offloading TLS termination to a CDN. So a single use case out of the 4 that were discussed today, without giving the content owner's private key to the CDN. In scope are TLS and DTLS, and that includes TLS 1.0 through 1.2. So no SSL, of course. And when TLS 1.3 is out there, that will be included as well, of course. No changes to the client side of the TLS protocol, and the solution should support all widely deployed TLS cipher suites. As far as I know, that does include the RSA, unfortunately, because it's out there in large enough numbers. I forget the latest statistics, but probably somewhere around 3%. The current work items include an informative use case document, which will document the CDN use case, but possibly other interesting use cases, and a standards track document that defines the interface between the edge server and the content owner. Here, security is a key concern, and of course, the assigning oracle. So avoiding assigning oracle where possible, or maybe we should say mitigating the assigning oracle issue as far as like practical. Provisioning and management and monitoring of the protocol's endpoint is not in scope, and not in scope is delegation of RSA and ECDSA keys/certificates for other purposes. So if you want to use a private key to sign a DNSSEC record or whatever you want to sign, that's not in scope for Lurk. And if we want to do any of this, this will mean that Lurk needs to be rechartered. So this charter with just one word change was posted to the mailing list. This is the proposal on the table right now. And let me open the mic.
Terakivinen, Inside Secure. I was thinking about the all widely deployed TLS CIFR suites, because we are trying to, work with the CDNs. And if it's only, 3% or 2% or 1%, some of those could actually be solved so that when we notice that, this is very old client, because the content owner usually has the, he has the, ability to serve the data also. So you could just say, okay, let's tunnel it from the CDN to the content owner, and let's take care of this long tail with very old clients with this. And if they, if there is a denial of service attacks, we can just drop them because they are probably the attacks anyway. So that would be, saying that, okay, we don't have to solve all of the possible, cipher suites. We can bypass some of those to the, to the other methods that is.
The one, I think, based on one of the discussions earlier, I think it might be worth, Eric Nygren, rather than specifying CDNs in particular, just in general, talk about between two different parties, between two different servers, because it's like CDN is one type of use case here, but there's no reason why one of those like you can see various combinations of CDN and cache things within the same party, different some of that for the second use case in the slide that are just all kind of the same piece of technical work, and it's just as applicable. One thing on the comment on the last one on is that if you wanted to be able to tunnel through stuff that's an older protocol, that adds a huge amount of extra complexity in, because now you have to do how do we actually tunnel through the TLS streams as well, which would be something that would be nice to try and keep out of scope here.
Phil Hornbaker. Yeah, I'm not too keen on this. I think that you need to first of all agree on the approach, and short-lived certificates and remote signing, well, remote key use are two completely different functions. I think that if you're looking at short-lived certificates, a more appropriate thing to do would be, given that ACME is looking to recharter soon or go away, would be to recharter ACME with that short-lived certificates as one use case. But I would like to see a use keys remotely as a separate working group. I would like to see TLS and CDN as specific use cases within that. I think that tying using keys remotely down just to TLS, though, is a bad plan, because there are other use cases like software signing, where we need to be able to put the key, the private key that the company is using out of their direct access.
So hi, Stephen Farrell. Just as a kind of an idea, we had that discussion, I think, the last off. Since then, there was no activity whatsoever about anything other than the CDN use case. So I think that question is answered. So.
Well, the other thing that comes up though is at the moment you're looking, when you're saying you're going to tie it to TLS, I mean, like you're effectively going to you're going to tie it to TLS version now. And if you do TLS version future, you will want to do the remote use differently.
This is DKG. So I am sympathetic with the goals here of protecting secret key material, but I am not convinced that the gain and the engineering work here actually ends up with us in a better position. In particular, the scope of the charter, by requiring no changes on the client side, seems to be the equivalent of saying we want to build a mechanism for undetectable server impersonation, which has a bunch of use cases that are not written in the charter, including government-mandated interception of communications. That is, there's a protocol for handing out your private keys for use by someone who's coming to compel you to do this. And don't worry, it's standardized. We have a way to do this. So just stand up your Lurk server and let us man in the middle the people that we want to do it. And the clients will be able to do it. So I just want to observe that while I'm sympathetic to the scheme here, I'm not convinced that the secret keys are necessarily worth more than the data that they are protecting, and that by standardizing a way to do, explicitly standardizing with the goal being undetectable impersonation may cause more harm than good.
Let me just point out that there are two existing protocols that you can use today if you want to do exactly what you were proposing.
So it seems to me that there are, going back to my previous theme, let me try to make this point press a little more sharply. There are two classes of designs. There are designs which change the client, and as DKG just indicated, this have a number of advantages in terms of verifiability and transparency for, I guess, the good value of transparency. And the designs which do not involve not changing the client. And the nominal advantage designs that involve not changing the client is supposed to be ubiquitous deployment, which is to say it works with every existing client. And just to take a step back, we know that we can actually deploy a large number of clients very quickly. We can't get anywhere near 100% saturation. We can get reasonably close. Not so close if you want to hit the breakage, but like you get a very large fraction of them. You get 80, 90% extremely quickly because all the browsers now want to update. So the point I'm trying to make here is that if the protocol you design leaves a substantial fraction of clients which are broken, large enough that actually you can't really front end everybody and you have to bypass some people to the back anyway to service them, then you should be asking the question, how big is the gap between that and what you would have gotten if you changed all the clients and just rolled them out tomorrow? And I don't know how big the answer to any of those questions is, but this goes to the question of static RSA, which is you need to find out how big that number is, because if that number is on the order of 5%, then you really might as well just design something that requires changing all the clients and maybe get to 80% instead of 95. So that seems like a first cost measurement you should take because it controls the protocol design.
Ben Schwartz, Jigsaw. So I just looked at sslabs.com. They have a list. They say that basically no version of Internet Explorer on Windows XP that they know about supports forward secrecy. So all IE users still on XP, which is not so much here, but in some other countries is quite a lot. I think are in your category. I agree with the previous two comments. I also want to make the flip side comment, which is it seems like you could get what we need here just by having a one call REST API where I can post a new key pair to the CDN. So if I post a key pair to the CDN to an HTTPS URL, then as long as I set up a cron job to do that every day, it seems like I'm done. And so basically, I think there isn't enough. I'm not convinced that there is enough work here, and I'm worried that, you know, if you set up a whole working group, you might end up with an overcomplicated solution to fill the working group.
Rich Sauls, Akamai. Yeah, static RSA is real important. And I think we do have to include it. Also, I share Dan's concern about the social implications of this. It bothers me a great deal. On the other hand, we have customers who don't want their private keys in dangerous spots, and I'll use my standard joke, China, Russia, and Virginia. So, yeah, it's got a social benefit as well as real social risks. Perhaps it'll just be that the security considerations outweigh the whole rest of the document when we write it.
So, Martin Thompson, I want to hear from people who need this. I've heard from Rich, and that's great. But apparently they have a solution currently, and if it's just one person in the room, then I think we're done. So I'm not hearing a lot of people standing up and saying that they need this. Can other people stand up and... Wow, overwhelming.
Well, I mentioned that this would be useful, but with not our use case is not a CDN use case, but our use case is like the general, like I have a server and I want to run it. I'm running it in an untrusted environment use case essentially, and that would be useful in that context. As far as I can see, the technical aspects are sort of the same, but I worry that like if we focus too much on the CDN use case, we end up like building something of technical solution that like specializes it to a CDN use case, or like says that, oh, if CDN or like something that we build and it doesn't work for the other use cases like dynamic traffic or anything like that. So that's the only thing that concerns me. Yeah.
Joe Hildebrand, I mean, I do care about the container use case, even though it's been declared out of scope, so.
Andre Popov, Microsoft. So there was a question about, you know, who else has some of these use cases. We definitely have a use case where we have servers in untrusted locations, which we wouldn't want to have, you know, where we don't want to deploy private keys. But I don't think that the Lurk solution is the best solution for that. I believe that the short-term certificates are much better. Those remote locations where our untrusted servers are remote enough that the round trip from the key server to the from the edge server to the key server would have been a significant detriment. And the other problem that exists in this solution is that, you know, the edge server needs to authenticate to the key server somehow, right? And then the credential with which the edge server authenticates to the key server is also in an untrusted location. So I think this solution has a lot of gaps, the Lurk style solution, whereas the short-term certificates, I think, could work.
So 2 points here. For short-term, so for either of the solutions, you will need authentication. And the point is, yes, you will need credentials on the CDN or on the client side, whatever it is, but they are less sensitive than the actual private key, presumably. And then to your other point, we will decide on either of the solutions once we have a working group, if we have a working group. So this is not a decision that's been made yet.
Eric Nygren, and kind of to echo what a few other people said, I think while I work for a CDN, our primary interest is actually the internal cases between our servers, not in talking with other, not in kind of the use case as described here. So I think, and I think it's one of those where if there's going to, even if it ends up not being used as widely between multiple different parties, there's enough complexities and subtleties here that, and people are going to start doing this sort of thing. So it'd be better to do it, to define some of it in a form where we could work through some of the technical details and figure out what are the different corner edge cases that could get done wrong, to remove as many of those as possible from the kind of best practice version of it. So other people trying to do the same thing don't cut themselves from the sharp edges. that people have learned from already.
So let me ask you, if we stick to the CDN use case, do you think that would allow us to cover the technical issues well enough so that this is a secure enough solution for other use cases you have in mind?
I don't necessarily see the point in defining the solution here or constraining it to CDN in this as opposed to generalizing it to still constraining it to TLS, but TLS between servers and different trust domains.
There's your Thakur Cable Labs. So I think I completely echo what he just said, that I don't personally have the CDN use case, but I do agree with the use case of being able to use my keys remotely. And in our case, or at least from my point of view, even the restriction to not change the client is, I mean, if it requires changing the client to some extent, it's still fine. The value in there would still be there for us.
Thomas Fossati, Nokia. We have a CDN, so the use case is perfect for us, but I'm totally open to widening out the scope for this, as long as the solution that we come up with is simple enough to be implemented in our stuff.
Diego Lopez, and another one replying to Martin's question for, hey, we want it. I mean, apart from the CDN, that is an interesting case. I agree with you in that the container case is of very high interest for us. And there are, well, I'm thinking about some other cases very much related with my usual matter around NFE that could be interested about this. I have not shaped them yet even in my mind, but I think that addressing this in the restricted scope of the CDN would make sense. I will provide something that looks like applicable in the other cases.
So Martin Thompson, Andre reminded me of one of the key sort of points that I don't think has been addressed in any of this, which is the reason that you put one of these servers in the CDN or in the edge or in one of these, you put them in Virginia, is because you have people in Virginia that you want to talk to and you want to get some performance advantages out of terminating TLS close to them. Do we actually have an answer for that? Does someone have a good answer for why this, using Lurk in this situation and adding all of that latency back into the situation is actually worthwhile having? Yeah, please do.
Yeah, Philhan Baker. It's not just the question of the latency, there's also the question of saving bandwidth, in that if you're terminating your TLS in Virginia and you're sending a trilobite of data, well, the Lurk part of it is only maybe a few kilobytes that has to go to, say, Czechoslovakia, and the rest of the trilobite can go from Virginia. So there is actually a
just much more pedestrian, Kyle Rose, would be session resumption, right? So you're going to the same server. Okay.
Hi, this is Sanjay Mishra from Verizon. So I just wanted to say that the two use cases that seem very useful from what I've seen here is that even the CDNI, which is not covered as part of the charter, but I think the delegated CDNs is an important case where you can have the secure keys work better in that case, because you have content owner has delegated to CDN1 and CDN1 has cascaded down to maybe 2 or 3 layers. I mean, CDNI working group is working on similar issues. So I think the distributing the key in this manner makes sense. And also, as Joe pointed out, the container use case seems to be making sense also from our point of view, from the Edgecast, as how we support the CDNs.
Stephen Farrell as Canadian. I'm kind of puzzled because a lot of people said a lot of the same things last time and nothing happened on the list at all about any other use case.
It's close enough unless you design it purely for one thing, so that unless you design it so that it can't do anything else. Yeah, unless you design Lurk so that it cannot possibly be used for something other than TLS, it works. It's only if you absolutely customize it so that it cannot be used for anything other than TLS that it breaks.
But nonetheless, there was no discussion on the list that I recall about anything other than TLS and CDNs since Buenos Aires. Is that correct, Jan?
I agree. What I'm hearing in the room is that if we change the sentence here from CDN to the 4 use cases that Daniel described, I think we will have a larger constituency, and that would, so technically it would still be the same scope.
Right, but at the possible risk of people only being interested in this whilst we're at IETF meetings for the 2 hours that we have above.
Agreed.
This is Joe Hildebrand. I liked Eric Nygren's formulation. I think that hit all the things that I cared about. So, and it was fun. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to point, Fulham Baker again, just wanted to point out that short-lived certs are going to happen anyway. So, I mean, and people aren't that bothered about blowing up CT. If CT can't deal with 365 certs per endpoint per year, it's going to have problems anyway. So that's probably something that trans are going to have to think about. The reason that you want to do short-lived certs is more than is in scope here, though. So the idea of having a Franken group that has 2 completely different ways of solving this, one of which has a large number of use cases that you've ruled out of scope, seems to me like a very bad idea. Short-lived certs have to happen because we've not got revocation in the web PKI at the moment. None of the browser vendors are doing revocation right. And so the only way that we can get a grip on that is to reduce the life cycle of the cert. So that's something that's probably going to be happening anyway.
So the reason why we mention CDN here is not that I prefer the short-term certificate thing. That's my personal preference, but that's not the reason why it's here. The reason why we have CDN here is that the only use case where we saw widespread support was CDN. And to be more specific, other than you, Phil, there was absolutely no interest in generic signing, except for the gentleman who mentioned DNSSEC earlier. And so even with that in mind, almost everything that we heard was about CDN, as opposed to the generic TLS termination thing. It's somewhat different in this room today.
Yeah, what I'm saying is you've got to choose an approach before you charter. You cannot charter saying we're going to solve a problem and then decide between 2 completely different ways of doing it. Because once you start doing a particular function, there are going to be other people interested in that particular function beyond the use case. And if you're going to propose a way of doing short-lived certificates for CDNs that doesn't work for our other uses for short-lived certificates, we are going to, as an industry, the PKI industry is not going to be very happy with it.
Hi, I'm channeling Sean Leonard. With all the private keys floating around on various services with the proposed Lurk model, it would make sense to label or annotate private keys in a common way to designate its intended use or sensitivity. These would be considered intrinsic properties of the private key, although they are not mathematical properties. Perhaps common labels or attributes for private keys intended for remote use or for keys for authenticating the untrusted entity to a Lurk server may make sense. Such common labeling might also help with identifying when to rotate keys out of service, for example.
So just to clarify that, Ericsson, we are interested by this solution and for internal use as well as for our customers.
And that's what use case or use cases?
Actually, it's I would say all of them. And well, the one I exposed, so interaction with the key server. So interaction with the key server is the one we would prefer. And
Are there short-lived certificates involved, or is this every transaction?
no short-term certificates. Every transaction, yeah. And well, I think the reason we didn't have so much discussions on the mailing list about the use cases is that, well, there is no major constraint. If one of the use cases is addressed, then the other is going to be also addressed. So we are not going to fight for something that is useless. So I think the use case is just a way to present that the scope of what we are asking for, and then if one of the use cases is addressed, then the other use case is going to be addressed. So I guess that's the reason we didn't have so many discussions on the mailing list.
Okay, however, the discussion of cipher suites, for example, is affected very much by which use case we care about. If we talk about CDN for the general population, then that basically forces us to do static RSA. Otherwise, maybe not.
Yeah. So we had the discussion on the ciphers, and I think, well, the one we included, all the one people thought they were useful, whatever the use case they were thinking about. So I think that it's a good question, but I think we addressed this question too. And so it might, well, so the question might be more which cipher you want us to support than which use case. Because it depends on the use case as well as deployment. So maybe the real question is which cipher. I don't know.
Not sure I agree with Daniel. And I have a question with regard to the use case, and actually it's a clarification question. So is the CDN interconnection covered by the CDN use case here?
At the moment, no.
Okay. Because we posted, Orange posted a draft about requirement from what could be a CDNI input for Lurk. And so it's good to discuss now why CDN interconnection is not part of the use cases.
So we saw very little traction, very little additional support on the mailing list, which is why there's only the CDN, so the basic CDN model on this slide.
Okay, this is clear.
Mike Bishop, I had a few comments. I have to agree with Phil that short-lived certs seems like it's going to happen anyway. And so it might, if that is a direction that's worth considering, then maybe instead of forming a working group, we should just be recommending this as a work item to the Acme recharter. And then if you do move forward with the working group, kind of a nitpick on the charter, you don't necessarily have to support all widely deployed TLS cipher suites. You have to support all widely deployed TLS clients. If you can support some cipher suite that those clients can speak, you don't have to support every cipher suite they speak.
Yeah, that was actually the way I understood what we're saying here. I agree that the wording right now is not very good because it would include some weird algorithms as well as PSK that's never used on the open internet. So yes, the intention is to support nearly 100% of clients, and the exact definition of nearly is TBD.
Okay, so Ben Schwartz, we've said, I think I agree that short-lived certs are going to happen and are essentially not a reasonable reason to create this working group. It's not enough work. So the remaining interesting work item here would be for essentially, I think of it as Diffie-Hellman offload. That is only useful if, so the reasons you use a CDN are either for availability, for latency, or for throughput. Those are the three things that you get from a CDN, I posit. Of those three things, running your own SSH server means that you do not get an availability advantage. If your server goes down, your whole site goes down. You do not get a startup latency advantage. You have to do round trips to your own server. So you only get the throughput advantage from the CDN. Yes, there's handshake latency and there's long-term connection quality, post-handshake connection quality. Okay, so you get post-handshake connection quality benefits, but you don't get the handshake latency improvements. And then in terms of security, compared to short-lived certs, the only advantage this gives you is that theoretically revocation is faster by a few days, effectively. Instead of revocation effectively taking place at timeout, it takes place immediately, except not for all the existing sockets, maybe not for all resumed sessions, depending on how that works, I don't know. So it's not really immediate either. So I really think that the window of benefit here is incredibly small.
All right, with that. So based on what we heard here, I'm kind of two minds whether we need to talk about the CDN use case only or the 4 use cases, and I will ask our AD's advice.
Don't know. So I think if the mailing list erupted into life to discuss the details of a whole bunch of other use cases, then that I think would change my opinion. But right now, I think I'm of the opinion that maybe it's not worth taking the usual homes. Because I'm not really hearing something here that I think is ready to go forward to a working group right now. Do people want to challenge that? I said I'm not, right now I'm not hearing the level of kind of concrete support for concrete things that would justify going forward with a working group at this point. So I'm proposing not to take the usual set of homes for a working group forming both. Okay. The list, go ahead.
So as the one who added confusion by introducing short-term certificates into this mix, let me take them out of the equation, whether they happen here or not, and then ask the room if there's interest in this work, in this becoming a working group, assuming that what we're doing is remote, remote signing for TLS, whether CDN only or a few other use cases.
Yavnir, this makes it very much more clear to me that this is something that I don't think needs to be done or should be done, or that a working group should be chartered to do that.
Joe Hildebrand, as long as that short-lived certificate stuff happens somewhere, whether it's an Acme somewhere else. I do think there's some edges there that need to be thought about and filled with. I'm fine with not having working group here to talk about that separately.
Sorry, quick clarifying question. I've fallen behind a bit here. What is being proposed to do in Acme?
Yeah, nothing yet.
Okay.
But
I mean, so it seems like, as I understand it, between triaging between your own and my friendly amendment to your own and Ben, we have a number of proposals for how you might have a cooperation between a key owner and an edge server to get them to arrange for a shortlist sort with the private key being on the edge server, and that might be something we're standardizing. And maybe Acme would be involved, and maybe Acme would not be involved, depending on exactly what structure you used. But I think it's like an eminently solvable problem.
Yes.
Well, I think we're talking whether it's going to be useful about this protocol, but it's already existing. So maybe the question is, do we want to have more than one version, or are we looking for that a different version of the same thing, or do we want to have one standard?
Rich Sauls, not to be what a common nickname is for me, but if it's right, the competing is the wrong word. The alternate proposals wouldn't meet our needs. So, unless it was particularly RSALG, other stuff, I don't see us synchronizing around a common single protocol.
So just to clarify, you said that neither the one presented by Daniel nor Yaron is something that you're interested in. Is that what you said?
I'd say we're most could be anywhere from 90 to 100% interested in the draft that I posted.
Okay.
I said remote signing for TLS. I don't think that excludes your proposal, and it definitely doesn't define one specific protocol or one specific draft.
Okay, so I think in any case, I think for today we have a conclusion that there's no immediate working group formation required here. The mailing list will remain open. People can continue to discuss, and we'll see. I think if something concrete enough emerges to, change the name and have another BOF at some point or whatever, and then I think there's clearly maybe a discussion to be had. As Acme is thinking about rechartering, to see what there might be done that would be of assistance, and secondly, also to tackle the thing about challenges that Yaron's proposal raised.
Ted Hardy speaking. Yes, I certainly the point you made about the security threat due to a rogue CDN should definitely be brought to Acme. And if people have Acme-specific mechanisms that they would like to propose as extensions to Acme, the current theory is a draft needs to be available to Acme, and we'll discuss it during a kind of rechartering phase that will be mostly in September, so that we know whether or not we're meeting to discuss a recharter in Seoul. But please understand that our current focus as a working group is in completing V.1, and that we hope to get that working group last called before Seoul. So if there is a bit of a delay in considering your draft, please don't take it as personal in any way, shape, or form. Thank you.
So I think there is time, but I don't have anything else myself, unless somebody's at the mic or Yaron has something.
I think we're done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.